Welcome to the Home Building Hub, your essential podcast guide to building your new home. Hosted by industry experts Colin Bischoff and Darren Brennan, this conversational podcast will help better educate you about all things new home building so you can avoid costly mistakes and enjoy your building experience to the fullest, no matter which home builder you choose.
Hey there folks, Colin here and welcome to the Home Building Hub. Sitting here with co-host Darren Brennan as always, and today we're going to be talking about all things site costs. So it's definitely one of the more complex, discussions and areas of builders and building quotes. It's certainly in our experience, Darren, it's something that clients do struggle to get their head around. So what we're going to do is we're going to break this episode up into two parts. The first part will be the short, the sharp, the most simple form of explanation we can give you about site costs, what they are and how it works. And that's for those who are just more interested in the basics. Then what we're going to do is we're going to dive into a little bit deeper into the topics, talking about soil classification, the different types of slabs and things like that. We will go into more detail so you have a better understanding. And when those of you who are reading your building quote and seeing these words come up, they're a little bit complex or difficult to understand, this should hopefully give you a better understanding of those terms and what they mean. Okay, so first off, I'll just see how you going, Darren.
G'day, Cole. Going well, mate. Really excited about this one. It's for some people this would be pretty boring, but for me, mate, I'm a bit of a lover of site costs and just the whole understanding of the slab design and all that sort of stuff. So I've spent a lot of time over the years educating, sales consultants about it and been involved in a number of different and tricky sites. And what I mean by a number, like heaps of them. And I find it really interesting. It even pushes right back to when I was studying, which I did study horticultural many years ago, and part of that was studying soil. So having a deeper understanding of soils and what they mean and how they, what's a clay and what's a sand and what's a silt and all that stuff is set right back in my mind from those days. So it's something, pretty excited to talk about. So, I think today I might even lead the way a bit on some of those discussions, which will be great, mate. Looking forward to it.
Yeah. No, that's good because I'm fairly much, to be honest, the opposite. I like the basics of site costs. I don't really care about the detail. It's more about getting it right, getting it done. And I think a client can get really confused, stressing out about things like site costs. And I guess for me, Daz, it's more, as we've said in previous episodes, it's more about that bottom figure, I should say, making sure you've got everything in there and your needs and your wants and all those things we talk about. But I think this will be a highly educational episode for those of you listening out there. But we'll kick off with the short, sharp, simple explanation. But before we do, Daz, can we cover off maybe a disclaimer if that's okay?
Absolutely. So whilst we're all about providing value to you, this podcast should not be considered as any legal or financial advice. It contains general information only, and you should seek out independent professional advice on your personal situation before making any financial or legal decisions. The other part is, if you're liking the podcast, and we've had, really, we're so pleased with the success it's having so far, please give us a 5-star. A friend was showing me how easy it is to do it on Spotify. I think I was suggesting that to you when we were having a conversation the other day, Colin. Jump on. Yep. I think to do it on Spotify might take all of about 3 seconds. So if you can spare us 3 seconds, we love a 5-star. Hopefully it'll allow more people to see the podcast out there and get access to the information available. So, really appreciate that. So, mate, awesome. The short, sharp, simple, shiny explanation of site costs, mate. Give us your rundown. Let's go.
Yep. Let's go with the easier version initially. So site costs, for anyone who's new to this, site costs are essentially the pricing the builder gives you for the site preparation and the foundation of your home. So the easy way to understand that is the concrete slab and what happens underneath it based on your land. Okay. So the reason, one of the things is pricing when you're looking at site costs, it's usually not included in the base price or in the standard inclusions. Okay, and the reason for that is that site costs vary from site to site. Okay, even one next door to one, to yours can vary in, the type of soil or the fill and the fall, and these things we'll cover in a second. Okay, so that's why a builder can't really predetermine or put in a predetermined figure for final site costs. Okay, so some of them do include a different type of, thickness in their slab, and we'll get to that detail shortly. But realistically, the reason you have a quote where site costs are separated to the base price is because of the sites varying in different levels, etc. So what I like to do, Daz, to explain this in a more simple way, realistically, is talk about only three things when it comes to site costs. Number one is fall, number two is fill, and number three is soil classification. Now, don't get me wrong, there's more info, there's more detail, there's more complexity, but to try and simplify this, fall represents the angle or essentially the height. If you're looking at that block and you're standing at the front of the block and it looks a little bit taller, a little bit higher at the back of the block to where you are standing, and only marginally, essentially what that's saying is the fall comes from the back to the front of the block. Okay, so it's the height in which that specific fall level is. So it
And
might be,
Colin,
for example, yep.
going to say on that point, you go visit a site and often you go, there's not much fall there. And then you get back the survey and it ends up being a meter and you're like, how could that be a meter? And even
Yeah.
us as, industry experts, mate, I've been fooled by that so many times. So don't make an assumption that your block is as flat as a tack until you've got that survey back or you've got further information, an engineering plan from a developer. So it can be a bit of a trap, that one.
I think most people think their block is flat, because anything up to a meter sort of looks a bit flat,
Yeah.
So what fall is that tells us, the builder, what that exact figure is. Okay, so it might be only 300 mil of fall, or it might be half a meter of fall, it might be 1 meter of fall. Now, the easy thing to understand is the more fall, the more site costs. Okay, that's probably the easiest way to put it. Okay, number two is fill. Okay, so one way I like to explain this, Darren, is that at some point in days gone by, the block that you're buying was probably originally farmland, okay? And then the developer came along and snapped up the farm, bought the farm, subdivided the blocks into smaller blocks. And then what they've had to do in some cases, in order to allow for drainage and a whole bunch of other things, realistically, sometimes they have to import fill, which is extra soil. Okay, so you may have a block where the original surface farmland level is now underneath a whole bunch of imported soil, which we call fill. Now, if you want to put a house on top of a block, in most cases, not all, but in a lot of cases, you can't just put the house on top of the loose fill. It needs to have additional support and piering underneath the slab that goes down through the fill into the original and the existing farmland surface to really hold it up firmly. Okay, so fill is one thing that can impact site costs in the sense of requiring additional support or concrete piers underneath your slab to dig right down and to maintain that foundation for the future. Okay, so fall and fill, they're the two I've talked about so far. Number three is soil classification. Now, every time you go with a builder, they talk about soil test and survey. A survey sort of gives you the levels. So we'll get to that and maybe in more detail later. But I guess it also tells us the soil test tells us the type of soil that your block is. Okay, so soil types can vary based on, I guess, how reactive they are, and how much it's, shrinks or swells. And obviously, the more reactive your soil type is, the more work required to provide a solid foundation for your home. Okay, that's probably the easiest way to put it. All right, so they're the three things.
Colin, it's essentially the clay content of that soil really is what's going to make it swell and contract more. So the higher content of clay, the more water that sticks to those tiny, tiny particles of clay. And therefore, when you've got more water in an area, then it swells up more. And essentially that means your house is going to potentially move more. And so they put a thicker slab in to protect your house. That's what it's. So you mentioned highly reactive. It's the water content that the soil will hold. And that's due to the clay content. And that's due to clay having really, really tiny particles that are able to attract a huge amount of water to the surface area of those particles. So, yeah. It's all about.
So hopefully that wraps up like the basic of basics to help people understand. Site costs are different for every single block. They're not included in a base price unless potentially, Darren, there's a promo from a builder where they include site costs, etc. One thing that I'll finish off on for the short, sharp explanation is builders are taking a risk when they're giving you site costs. Okay, so there's so many variables and so many factors and a lot of information they don't have up front. So therefore, they take a bit of a gamble on the information they do have, and then later on, as you get through the process, they then find out more information about, and more detail about your house on that block and what's required specifically. Okay, so please understand, I wouldn't get hung up on comparing site costs from one builder to another. It's really important. Again, you look at the overall figure. Different builders have different levels of inclusions. They have different prices for concrete. They have lots of different variables and reasons. One thing you need to know about site costs, they're important. And you don't want to have a builder taking any risk on what the site costs are, because that's the foundation of your home ultimately, and the builder has to warrant that. Okay, so it's not something to get too hung up on or argue about. It's something that you need to make sure it's done properly, and your builder's doing, providing you with a foundation that supports your home properly. Okay,
Great,
hopefully
mate.
that covers it. Yeah.
Nice, short and simple. I like it.
Yeah, good. So for those who want to hang around a little bit longer and get into the more nitty-gritty stuff, what I'm going to do is I'm going to prompt Darren, because he's got a lot more skill experience in this space than myself. I'm going to prompt him with some questions and chip in where need be, Daz. But so I think one of the first things I want to ask you is, Darren, how would you say that site costs are actually determined by a builder up front?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, Colin, it really depends on what level of information that you have available. So generally, you'll have if you'll have a land contract, and you'll have, this block of land. Now, it may be ready or it may not be ready. But if it's either way, if there's an engineering plan available, then for the most part, the builder will be able to, gather a fair bit of information about that. And that engineering plan will generally tell them about two of the three things you spoke about earlier, which will be the fall. It'll tell them how much fall, and it'll only be specific generally to the four corners of the block, but they can make some assumptions of how it's falling from there. And then number two will be the fill. So if the developer's actually having to fill any of those lots, it should, on the engineering plan, determine on there how much fill there is. And so, if you're looking to get an allowance or a fixed site cost up front to understand what it is, then they'll need to have that sort of level of information. They'll make assumptions around the type of slab that's going to be required from their experience. So, often they'll have built in the estate 50 metres down the road or 100 metres down the road or whatever. So they'll know, all right, every other house we built in that area is built on a H-class slab, for example, so a 385 mil slab. And that'll give them a bit of a determination to that. And then what they'll allow to do is from that engineering plan. And essentially what an engineering plan is, a bit like a plan for a builder. It's a two-dimensional plan of how they're going to build that land. And that'll have been stamped off by the council and the other relevant authorities to make sure that it's going to drain well and it's going to be buildable and etc. So it's a signed off plan usually. Sometimes in the early days it might not be at that point, but they've had their engineer. It's called an engineering plan because an engineer, so a pretty smart person, has had a look at it and gone, this is how the best way to build this. And then there may be other contributing factors that come into that, but for the most part, a pretty experienced person's come along and said, here's how we're going to build this parcel of land, and the builder will then look at that information and make some determinations around what those costs are going to be based on that information. So whether they're going to need things like retaining walls potentially, or how big a site cut there's going to need to be, etc. So, and we'll cover some more of that detail as we sort of flow through. I guess, most builders will look to fix site costs up front, when it suits. But sometimes there'll be too much fall or too much fill or other stuff that they need to gather before they can fix that amount up front. So, it's worth being aware that, not always can they fix it, and they might have different reasons for that. And then one builder might choose to fix it and another builder may choose not to fix it because it suits their business model. That doesn't mean that one's going to charge you more because they didn't fix it. They may actually end up, the end number may end up being less than the fixed number once all of the information is available. So, and what I mean by all of the information, when they've got the soil test and then they've got a level survey for their lot, they're now in a much stronger position to be able to, fix or determine what the real slab site cut, etc., is going to be. So, the more information they gather, the stronger, position they're in to actually, I guess, secure what that price will look like. So, and away we go from there. So, yeah, and I guess ultimately you'll know your slab design when the engineer comes back with the engineered slab design. So the builder will have an independent engineer, and they'll come back with a slab design based on that. So I
which
guess that's sort of
happens a lot later down the track. So
absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely.
important to identify this engineering plan. Usually we get a set of documents as a builder from a client or really from a developer. One's a plan of subdivision, which is a snapshot of the dimensions and the size of your block. And it's got a few of the restrictions on there. But the other one, the engineering plan, is something mostly the builders dig up or get from the developer. And that's the one that's got the little numbers, the fill, the fall information, and the site costs will pretty much be based off that engineering plan, Darren. When it's upfront with the sales consultant at a builder.
Yeah, absolutely,
Yeah, that's how it sort of works. Yeah.
for sure.
The next question, I guess, pretty topical is, well, can you maybe elaborate a bit more on what are fixed site costs versus allowances? And let's talk a little bit maybe to finish it off about what would the exclusions potentially be and in the event that there are some.
Yeah, for sure. I guess most builders will look to fix their site costs with, and I say with limited exclusions, or potentially no exclusions at all. So they may say this is fixed without these items, or this is completely fixed and doesn't matter what happens. We're assuming all that risk, and that would generally be on fairly flat lots. And I say, look, as a rough idea, blocks up to a meter of fall over it, but again, it'll vary builder to builder, and it'll vary on how big the block is, because a meter on a 300 square meter block is quite a bit of fall, but a meter on a 1,000 square meter block all of a sudden becomes a lot less fall. So it's understanding most blocks these days in most areas, in certainly in greenfield estates, are well under 1,000 square meters. So you're unlikely to be building on 1,000 square meters. But I think the average in Victoria is now about just over 400 square meter block. So on a 400 square meter block, a meter of fall is quite a fair bit of fall. So they will assume that responsibility for any potential cost changes if they fix that site cost, and they'll fix that based off the developer engineering, or if they have it, a soil test and site survey. And they may well request to be able to fix that you go and get a site survey and a soil test done. So that's the sort of level of information they'd be fixing that amount off, and they'll take some calculated risks around that. They'll look at that information, they'll determine what they think is going to be required. And again, they're experts to a certain level, but they're not engineers often. So, the engineer ultimately will determine what type of slab, what, how, where, what, why that is being laid out. It comes back to the engineer, and they're an independent engineer of the builder. So that gives you some level of, protection there as the consumer. And then you've got your allowance. So often there's insufficient information. It could be an older block. There's just not an engineering plan available. So, it could be an example. It could be significant fall. There could be other things like significant trees on the site. There could be trees that have been removed from the site. There could be, a knockdown rebuild site, for example, where the builder up front just can't assume that risk of what that's going to be until they get all of the information. So often what they'll want to do then is obviously organise a soil test and survey. They may even want to seek an actual engineering design so that they're now pricing what the final product will be. And that's, look, at least you know what exactly you're getting then. So if you do get an allowance, the builder will at some point have the engineer's design and, look to finalise that price. In your contract, they may have some provisional sums, being some costs that they can't still determine until they're actually on site and of actually completing the work. So there may well be some provisional sums in your contract for those type of items. And that, for example, could be boreholes, so they could need boreholes and they've got to drill in. They might not know, they've done, when they do a soil test, they'll do between 3 and 5 drill holes on a block. They've got limited, again, they've got a fair bit of information, but it hasn't told them every part of that block. So there's a fair bit still at stake. And again, on tricky lots, builders just might put an allowance in or, run that path. Or you might want to contract really fast. And so, again, with limited information and time against you, they'll put an allowance in. And again, you'd like to hope the allowance is going to be pretty close to the mark, but understand that, again, they're taking a guess at that point. So allowance is really a best educated guess. And then when you get your contract, you'd like to hope that you've got more information available. And the other part could also be, is that the land might not be titled. So again, limited information on an untitled block is, a big risk for the builder to be taking on. So, they don't want to be putting themselves in that position. And we've all heard the stories of late about builders' margins and builders going broke. So we don't want to be putting builders in that position where they go broke, because the last thing you want to do is go, great, I've got a really cheap site cost, but my builder went broke. Well, it's not cheap anymore. It's got very expensive for you and very headache-like. So you thought you were trying to getting away with a fast one, but in the end, you probably lost if you get to that point. So, getting that information up front, I think, is pretty important. What else is going to? There certainly can be exclusions too, and things such as rock often is excluded from builders' fixed site costs. So if they experience rock on the site, again, when they do a soil test of your site, they can often determine how much rock is, or, what's the likelihood of striking rock. So at least you can be a little bit educated. They'll often, if they think they're going to hit rock, put provisional sums in for that. So there'll be allowances in the contract. But again, if there is rock hit and they've got exclusions, then understand they're going to come back to you for that cost. Could be items such as screw poles, meaning that, they may have allowed for board piers, but all of a sudden those are requiring to be a lot deeper than expected, and they're now needing to put in screw poles. So that could be an exclusion. It could be stuff like underpinning of neighbouring sites. So when they first spoke to you, there was no neighbouring site there. Now there is, and we've got to be mindful that we're not, doing damage to the neighbour's property. So all those sort of things can often be exclusions. It's worth just asking what's excluded, so you understand if you've got a site cost there, what's excluded from a site cost. What haven't you taken into account? And away we go from there. So hopefully that sort of helps a little bit between fixed and allowances. But yeah, I guess for me personally, when I've been selling, I've always said I'm not a betting person myself. So I'd like to fix it, even if that means I might be paying a little bit more, because I don't want to take that risk. I don't want to be an insurance company later, right? I'd rather take out my insurance and pay that bill and know that I'm not getting a bigger bill later. So for me, I'd prefer to fix it personally. And I'd prefer when I'm selling to a customer to fix it, and I'll sell you the reasons why, exactly what we're talking about. I'm not going to take that risk. I'd rather them not assume that risk. Let's fix it up front and know that then what goes into your contract. But again, it's not always available to be fixed. So be mindful on that.
Yeah. Darren, you talked a little bit about soil and survey. So just want to maybe elaborate a little bit more on who does the soil and survey test. What does it entail? You mentioned boreholes, but maybe we'll just go a little bit deeper on that. And probably the main reason to understand for people is you can do a soil and survey test on titled land, and that's going to give you more detailed information, but you cannot do it on non-titled land. So the builders basically, as Darren said, relying, guessing the site cost based on the engineering plan provided by the developer, which is the proposed levels and fill on, what's to be constructed out there on that land. So tell us about the importance of a soil and survey test. Who does that, and what's the benefit?
Yeah, so I guess an independent engineer will perform a survey. So they'll go and work out and determine the levels, so how flat or how not flat your block is. And they'll also perform a soil test. So the soil test, they'll drill holes into the ground, and they can go in either to as far as their drill will let them, or up to about 2.5 meters at sort of the maximum, unless they've got some other concerns where they might get a deeper drill. But again, that's a really extreme circumstance. I mentioned earlier, they'll sort of do between 3 and 5 drill holes on the block. And from that, they'll pull out these big, long cores of soil. So they'll pull out a cross section really of that soil, and then they'll go and examine that. So they'll take it back to their laboratory or their office, and they'll now examine those different layers. And if you've ever looked at layers of soil or seen even where there's been a road cut in, for example, you'll see different colors of the soil. So you might see it quite dark at the top and it's got a bit of grass growing out. And then it gets into, changing color as it sort of gets in deeper and it starts to get a bit drier, potentially, and it starts to go a bit more yellow in color potentially. So all these are sort of different layers of soil, and they'll examine all that and they'll determine from that what impact water's going to have, because water's the beast, I guess. So water's the one they're looking at, and that is what impact is lots of water or no water at all going to have on this soil. So is it going to swell a lot or is it going to contract a lot? And then if it's swelling and contracting, what's that doing to the house as that soil moves? And, a great example would be you put your boots on and you go walking through a muddy site and you come back 2 inches taller because all this mud's stuck to your shoes. Then that's the swelling bit we're talking about. That's the land that's now, because it's so wet, it's stuck to your shoes and it lifts up and now you're 2 inches taller. So, for Cole,
Sounds
that's
good to me.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. But, that's really what it's referring to. And then that engineer will give their recommendations based on all of that information. So they'll go and gather all that information. They'll also consider the neighbouring properties. They'll consider trees. They'll be looking at all that. So they actually have to go to site to determine that, to give that recommendation. And then that soil test and survey and ultimately their engineering plan are all signed off on by the building surveyor. So you can't get a building permit without having that information. So all that information is provided in order to get a building permit, and that's getting signed off either by a building surveyor or by your council. So it's certainly that's who does it, I guess, and what they are.
Nice. Okay, so we've got a better understanding of fill, fall, compaction, I guess, as part of fill, what a soil test and survey is and means. The last one on this sort of space, Darren, or this area, I wanted just to get people to understand a couple of other things that impact site costs. Even if you have a flat block with no fall, with no fill, there are things that can impact the site costs in addition. So one of those would be easements. And you did mention before quickly underpinning, and someone wants a swimming pool, etc. But I think easements is probably the most common one. Could you explain, A, what an easement is, and B, how does it impact your site costs?
So an easement, usually when it comes back to builders and lots in sort of residential estates, is referring to an area that's got generally pipe work or cables, etc., running through it. So it would be often at the back of a block, could be running down the side of a lot, sometimes at the front of a lot, and that will have things like your sewer pipe and your stormwater pipe in those easements, and then they'll be at different depths depending on what's required. So again, as you can imagine, water flows downhill. So if you're at the start of that line, it'll be shallower, and if you're at the other end, it's got to flow downhill. So that'll be getting deeper depending on where that is, and they could also be getting thicker. So at the start of the line, there's less water and sewage and stuff running through it. But further down the line, you've now collected the last 10 houses along the line, so you need a bit bigger pipe. So that can also impact what that is. And again, depending on what the pipe is, how it's going to be structured, could determine on how big that easement is. So traditionally, a 2 metre easement would be pretty common. You might end up with a 2.5 or 3 metre easement. Sometimes they can be huge, depending on what's in there. I've seen electrical easements at 10 metres, very rarely, very rarely. But, all that will be determined on your plan of subdivision. And some of that further detail will be on your engineering plan. It may not tell us how deep that pipe is, and we would request that information later. But we'd make the assumption generally most pipes are sort of between 1.5 metres and 2 metres deep, right? So again, if it's travelled a long way, then it might be getting deeper. But, most times you'd sort of assume that 1.5 to 2 metres deep, the pipe, and in a 2 metre easement. And if it's a 2 metre easement, that pipe might be a metre off the boundary. So sitting right down the middle of that easement, maybe a little bit further out. So that's really what an easement is. And then how does that impact your build? Well, the closer you build to that easement, then you now need to protect your house if the chance that they need to repair that pipe or do something to that pipe and they've got to dig that out. You've got to stop your house falling in that hole they just dug out. And probably a great example to look at what that looks like is if you go to the beach and you dig a hole, you know what it's like. It just keeps getting bigger, right? It's not easy to dig a really single hole in the soft sand, not in the wet sand. In the wet sand, it's usually a bit easier. It stands a bit more upright and you can make it kind of work well. But in the soft sand, you dig a hole and you're trying to dig a hole, the size of a bucket, but it ends up being the size of, a swimming pool because you can't get to the depth you want without making it wider. And that's really what we're referring to here is, we want to put piers in if you're really close so that the house doesn't fall in. And that's not right up against the pipe. That's back from the pipe because it'll fall in that hole. So, as that, the deeper the pipe and the further away we get is certainly better. We want to get further away from that pipe. So that's kind of giving you a bit of an idea, hopefully.
Yeah, so essentially when you build close to an easement within a metre or two, you're looking for an increase in site cost based on additional support required under the home.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay, good.
And again, one of the big costs can be if you've got an easement on, and it doesn't have to be on your property, it can be on the neighbouring property. So just because it's not on yours doesn't mean it doesn't impact your house and doesn't mean we have to not take that into consideration. So you could have a side easement on the neighbour's property, right? That's still only 2 metres or 1.5 metres from yours that we've now got to take into consideration. And it's a lot longer run. A side of houses are usually longer than they are wide. So, that can have a bigger impact and more cost. So just be mindful of what that's like.
Yeah. Okay. I'd like to talk about next slab upgrades, Darren. So I guess to understand what this means for people. So a concrete slab is the foundation of the home.
Absolutely.
Some builders include, a certain type or class of slab. Some include a little bit better or stronger or firmer or thicker. So just take us through what are slab types and what are slab upgrades and just help the listeners understand a bit more about that sort of area.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole range of different slab types, and they range from I'll run you through them because it's something that a lot of people don't realize. So basically the smallest slab or the easiest slab or slab type or soil classification would be an A class, which is really based back onto a moist sand or rock side. So really little reactivity, little movement on the slab. Then you move to an S class, which is slightly reactive. So again, might be a sandy type. And that's often, these are really good because they sort of relate back to, so S being more like sand type soils, an N class being a moderately reactive. And that's the most common one that builders include. I don't know a builder out there these days that includes an S class. I know when I first started in the industry, a couple were. So they were kind of going, hey, look how cheap our base house price is because we've got this really small, really underperforming slab for most conditions that we certainly see in most of the areas that we build. So these days, most builders include an M class. Some are including a H class, which is a highly reactive site, meaning, H being, I guess, a higher slab, so it's thicker, it's got more concrete and stuff in there, and that's got greater movement. One of the more newer ones that we come across is E class, and again, for a long time, I hadn't seen any class till probably, might have been 5 to 10 years ago, and now E classes are coming in more often, and again, E is extremely reactive, so it means the soil's going to move a lot when that water comes into contact with it, and they're becoming more common because, as we learn over time, we want to make sure that slab doesn't move. The last thing somebody wants is that their slab moves. So, the engineers are going, hold on, we're going to protect the consumer. We'll put a thicker slab in. We'll go to an E-class slab and more steel, etc. in that slab and just give them more protection. And then the last one's a P-class or problematic sites, and it's often relating to fill. But a P class can be related back to any of the different soil classifications. So any of those 5 different soil classifications really can end up with a P, an underlying P class, and that's referring to problematic, often referring to the fact that it needs piers. It's going to be subsiding soil, could be, potentially landslips, could be an old mine site. I mean, I live in Ballarat. There's mine sites everywhere here, so it could be on one of those. Could be soil subject to erosion, so you might be near the beach where the wind is, or on the side of a hill where it's going to get blown away. It could be a demolition site. So it's, all those are problematic situations, and they'll often require piers to make sure that that's supporting the home. So I guess that's a little bit about the slabs themselves, and the different types. I guess a few bits play into the whole picture, Colin. So, when you look at site works or site costs, really 3 or 4 items are really considered. One is the preparation of the site. 2 is the upgrades from the builder's standards with regards to the slab itself. And piers, etc., along we just spoke. The third one's the drainage requirements. And the last one is any additional requirements, things like retaining walls when needed, additional service runs, surveys, etc. So if we consider the site preparation, things that would be considered in that site preparation is the site cut or fill. And that's basically trying to make the block flat. We need to build on a flat platform. So, and I say most volume builders build on slabs. Not many of them build on stumps. So most of them are built just across the top of the ground with a concrete slab. And that's what we're talking about here. In the situation where there's fill, they may either require to bring some fill onto that site, so that's adding cost. They're going to get it from somewhere else and bring it to that site. They may be required to remove the fill from that site because they've got too much soil. They've cut all this soil out and they've got too much soil and they've got to get rid of it, so they're paying trucks to get rid of it. That's all adding cost, either in or out. The other part with fill is compacting any of that added fill. So if they add fill, they're really got to make it solid. They're going to make it a solid foundation to which they can pour their slab on top of. So they've got to compact that fill. They'll often need a site survey to establish the level of the land, which we spoke about earlier. And then, we've spoken about easements, so they need to make consideration around the easements, how that's going to impact. And they also need to make consideration around things like existing things. So there could be a swimming pool on the site already, or if they're going to put a swimming pool in, what does that mean when they're preparing that site? And does that impact the type of slab? And absolutely it can. And underpinning. So if you've got existing structures on the site or nearby the site, and that could be your own property or the neighbouring property. For example, you've got a garage right on the boundary and you're going to put your garage right up next to that garage. Then we've got to make consideration around when we're excavating that site. Are we going to be doing potentially damage to the neighbour's property or to your shed that's on your property or to any of those sort of structures that could be there, and making sure that we're protected in that space? So I guess that's a little bit about the site preparation. If you're happy, Colin, I'll jump forward to a bit about slab upgrades. Have you got any you wanted to add there about the site preparation, Col?
Only one thing, just to try and explain, so hopefully it's all connecting for people that are listening, that the fill and the fall impact, the actual figure. But you said before that we got to flatten the block, basically. So
Absolutely.
at the start of the episode, we said, okay, picture yourself, because we're on an audio medium here, it'll be easy to have a visual reference for people, but picture yourself standing at the front of the block, and at the back of the block, it's higher than where you are standing. So what the builder may need to do in that example is they may need to cut into that hill at the back of your block a little bit. They may need to bring soil into the front of your block in order to achieve a level building pad. Now, when you cut into a block, Darren, you mentioned a thing called a retaining wall, and that's essentially timber, or mostly timber, sometimes concrete, but with builders, mostly timber sleepers that get put up against the soil that's been cut into to make sure it doesn't fall over onto your block. Okay, so these are pretty common on sites that have significant fall, or perhaps even a metre or above. There'll be most likely retaining walls put on. The only comment I'd make is a lot of builders don't do full turnkey, meaning the landscaping as well. in our case, what we do, Darren, is we do full turnkey. So we're actually factoring in retaining walls quite a lot, as opposed to most builders, because we have to consider the landscaping component as well. Okay, so a lot of builders can what they call batter off. So if they're from the edge of the house to the end of the block, they can sort of have a slight hill going up or down, just to rather than putting a retaining wall in, whereas we have to factor that in. So I'm saying this, at some point you'll need landscaping. So if you've got a block with a lot of fall, it's worth understanding site cost wise with your builder what sort of level of fall it's going to be from the house to the end of your block, and whether there's going to be a need for retaining walls and things like that, because they do add extra cost. Yeah.
I know. Likewise with us, we tend to include a lot of retaining walls, and again, it's about giving the best outcome for the customer at the end. So sometimes, like what you actually end up with your house is going to be pretty important. I mean, I remember a site many years ago that I went and looked at in Bendigo, and we were proposing retaining walls, and we ended up losing the job. So we didn't actually end up building. But I went to the job afterwards, and there was about a 4 metre fall from the front door to the street. So if you tripped over at the front door, you'd done 6 somersaults by the time you hit the curb. And I'm like, that's a crazy outcome for that customer. How do they even get out of the front of their house? So sometimes retaining walls can really assist in getting a great outcome. I was in Warrnambool this week, and I saw some sites where I'm scared to think how you get your car in the garage. Like the garage is so much higher than the street that I think the builder in this case was actually negligent, because they've provided something that's not fit for use. You've got a garage to put a car in. You can't get a car in there. You need like a monster truck to get in, and then it smashes the roof off. Like, it's just crazy. So
it's a good point.
Some of that stuff happens.
Good point. We see that quite regularly, Darren, actually, with because we do put retaining walls in to allow for as well. And the clients often say, well, your site costs are too high, or the other builder says they don't need retaining walls. And technically, sure, you don't need the retaining wall, but it's going to mean you're walking out of your house off a cliff, if you're not conditioning for that. So you may as well put the retaining walls in and have a better build outcome. And that's the difference between, and we always say, Darren, it's not all about the price. If you're buying for price, you're probably going to make a mistake, and you're going to pay the price yourself down the track. The builder's being open and honest and say, look, you need retaining walls. You need to put this in, need to put that in. We need to go to it's a P-class site classification. We need to provide a stronger slab with piering. It's better for you in the long run that they do that than just go, oh, don't worry, we'll just do a H class. I mean, there's rules around what they can and can't based on those tests anyway. But the point remains the same. Please take the advice of a builder and don't just judge the price. It's really important that you don't do that, because we see these mistakes every single day of every single week, don't we, Daz?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess kicking on to about the slabs itself. So, again, we mentioned most builders include an M-class slab. So that's 305 millimeters thick, right? So it's quite a thick slab, really. That being said, the engineer will then make their recommendations on the back of the soil test and survey as to what sort of slab they require. And often this will mean that, you need to upgrade that slab to, for example, a H-class slab, and that's a thicker slab. That's a 385 mil thick slab, or it may be required to be thicker again. We're seeing some of that occur at the moment where again, the engineers are hedging their bets a bit higher, and that's probably to your benefit, to be fair. If the engineer is slightly over engineering, that's not a bad thing. If they're under engineering, that is a bad thing, right? Yeah. So be mindful if they're it's suggested that you're going to need slightly more. That's actually not a bad thing. That's protecting you in the long run. It may require some additional reinforcement steel inside that slab design to make sure that, again, it doesn't move and that it's holding together and really strong. They can also recommend piers. Well, we spoke about piers again for that fall, the fill, etc. Those things are going to take into example why that would, cause the need for piers or up against an easement. And again, the other one is for trees. So again, if you've got street trees, that tree today might only be 1.5 meters high, but eventually it's going to be 20 meters high, and they're going to consider that. They're going to say, well, what sort of tree is it? We're going to make an assumption that that's going to get to its full height at some stage, and that may well impact the slab of your home, and you're going to be there in 15 years' time when that tree's huge, and now it's lifting your house, and you don't want that. So you put piers in to try and protect against that. So those things are all considered as part of the slab upgrades. I mentioned the underpinning of the neighbouring properties or any structures on your site that you may be close to. And generally speaking, underpinning, if you're within a metre, or closer, sometimes depending on how deep their footings are on their home, how deep, if they've got piers or, any of that stuff may determine if you need to go deeper. But it also could be up against a retaining wall. So you may underpin a retaining wall also. So all those things will take, be taken into consideration with regards to the slab upgrades required. And again, that's pretty much determined by the engineer. So you've got an independent expert determining what that looks like. So that's kind of your slab upgrades part, Colin. And then we kick over into, and again, I don't know if you want to add anything there, mate, but I think that covers it pretty well.
No, not for that one. Yep.
And then drainage requirements. So the other one is that, and this has been a change over the last, few years, where they now need to give an independent drainage requirement. So the same engineer is going to give a design for the drainage to your site. They've got to make sure that the water's able to get out and that there's enough pipes to get the water out. So if you've got a big rainfall, we don't want to have pipes bubbling water out under the ground and then doing damage to your slab. It may require a full, what they call a sealed system, where all the pipes are sealed together, so joined together and glued together, so that from the downpipe on the roof all the way to the street or wherever that water's going to, that water can't escape. Or it could be, traditionally that there's a gap at the ground, and if you go outside your home, most homes would be the case that the downpipe's loosely connected, and that allows for any movement. So if the house is moving up and down, it allows for that sort of movement, of the home, and not seeing those pipes break apart. So they'll take all that into consideration based on your exact site. And then depending on your site, I was on a site just the other day, Colin, and it had what they call a pump and pit, and that was because the connection point for the stormwater was actually higher than where the pipes were coming out. So you can't push water uphill, unfortunately. You need a pump to do that. So these guys have to put in a pit that collects the water and a pump inside that pit that then pumps it back out where it needs to go. So sometimes that'll be required. Again, additional cost. It's not often, but it's it might be 1 in 50 sites. So it's not, every site. And so the chance of you being on one of those sites is fairly low, but It is a common item. The other thing that is considered these days is aggie drains, and aggie drains are agricultural drains. And what they are is drains under the soil that do drain the water away from the house. So, they need to drain the water away. Any additional water that's flowing towards the house, they need to try and get that away from the home. We don't want water going under your slab, right? Because water under your slab means the slab swells, and that's the worst. If the land subsides, it's not great, but it's okay. If the land swells, so you get lots of water under your slab, that's where the problems come. And that's what they call slab heave. And we want to avoid that at all costs. 1, for the builder, 2, for the homeowner. Because when you've got slab heave, you've got lots of movement in your home, and we don't want that. And that's caused by water getting underneath your slab. So every consideration to get any water away from underneath your slab should be considered. And again, Cole, I didn't put in our notes, but I think one great document, there's a CSIRO document around how to care for your slab, and every builder should be giving you that when you get the keys to your home. Please read it. Like, it's really comprehensive. It's really easy to understand, right? But it does give you feedback around planting trees right next to your house, putting a structure on your home that allows water under the home. These things that really give you good feedback. So have a read of that document. You can just Google it, CSIRO, foundation or slab. It'll pop up. And otherwise, shoot us an email and we'll shoot it across to you, and we'd be happy to share that with you. But it's certainly something really worth, consideration, I guess, and understanding, because it's going to help you in the long run and protect your home. So that's a bit about drainage. You want to add anything in there, Cole?
No, I think what we'll do, Daz, we'll finish with top few tips for people
Absolutely.
looking at site costs. So I guess I'll do the first one here, which we did already mention. To be honest, our advice to you is don't judge a builder on their site costs alone. And that they may be different to another builder. They may have factored in retaining walls, different slab types, etc., which realistically they can't finalise up front. They can't do that until way down the track. So one builder's taking more of a risk by giving you potentially a cheaper site cost. One's giving you maybe taking a little bit less of a risk, but putting in more strength, more thickness, more etc. into your slab and foundation, which is probably the better option. The other thing, understand that included in the base price inclusions is the M class, but some have a H class. So if someone's already got a H class included in their slab like we do, then our site costs are likely to look and be cheaper because you've already paid for the jump from M to H in the base price. Okay, so our base price may be higher as a result, but our site cost should be lower. Okay, so that's why we always say look at the final figure. That's the number one tip we've got. What are the next one, Darren?
I think on that note, understanding also, Colin, that every engineer is independent and they'll have an independent view on that site. So often they agree. They say, yep, we think you need this. And they both agree. But other times you'll find that they'll have a differing opinion. Doesn't mean one's right or one's wrong. It could be because, for example, at Metricon, we offer a lifetime guarantee versus the statutory warranty of 7 years. So we're warranting that for a hell of a lot longer. So our engineers are taking that into consideration. So that could be one of the impacts.
Yeah.
They may have had greater experience on that site, in that area, and understand that they've had headaches, that particular engineer, and that's caused grief, whereas another engineer might not have dealt a lot in that area. So they may be like, oh no, it's okay. We've not seen the headaches that are here. So it's sort of, they're going to vary at times between engineer and engineer. And I guess my advice on that is if an engineer is recommending more things, a thicker slab, more steel, that's never a bad thing. It's only a positive. Yes, it comes at a cost, but it's only a positive. It means the more stronger your slab is and the more stronger your foundations of your home, then the less likely you're going to have headaches in the long run. And no one wants those headaches. The builder doesn't want them. The homeowner doesn't want them. There's no winners when your house is moving. There's only losers. So we want to make sure that you're getting the best possible slab to suit your house design without going crazy. I mean, we could go bananas and put in 2 meter thick concrete slabs and the thing will never move, but you can't afford it either. So it's a fine line between both. So that'd be my tip is understand that different engineers under different circumstances will make different recommendations on the exact same lot.
Yeah. The final tip, I guess, for both of us is now, I'll say this we don't want to get our developer friends offside. We would advise people who are looking for a house and land package to let a builder help you find a block. Okay, and the reason we say that is because the builder is going to factor in the engineering, all the information we talked about on this podcast episode, fill, fall, etc., etc. We're going to look at that and work out what the house will fit the block and give you a lot more information, whether it needs retaining walls, this, that, and the other thing, over and above, I guess just looking at a block and looking at the price and looking at the orientation and where it is and which estate that you prefer. So again, it's not against developers selling a block before you even talk to a builder. It's more just saying, if you want our advice and our opinion, you probably best sit with a sales consultant from a builder, 1 or 2 or 3 of them, to help you find the right block and help you determine what the conditions are of that block. Because we've seen, and we see it every single week, where someone's gone and bought a block of land without understanding anything about fill, fall, anything about site costs, and they come to us and they say, can you please give me maybe they got that block at a really cheap price. They think they got it at a cheap price, but the reality is by the time they come to the builder's then going to say, oh man, that's got 1.6 meters of fall, or it's got, over 2 meters of fill. It's got an easement running down the side of it, all these things. And it doesn't mean the block's terrible. It just means that, well, you may have got it a little bit cheaper off the developer, but now the site costs are going to be unknown or going to be super expensive through the builder. Okay. So you're not, you're not winning. We're just saying, my tip: go and sit with a sales consultant to help you understand whether you should or should not buy that block.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it does touch into, I guess another part of that, Cole, not related to site cost, but again, the orientation of that lot, and particularly coming up when the new 7-star requirements, it's going to become more and more important. So again, it's just helping guide you to getting the right block to suit your home that's going to be the most cost effective and deliver the best outcome for you and your family. So, it definitely helps in that space for sure.
We do have other episodes covering that. We don't necessarily do you buy a house or land first. We've got a whole episode on that, but we sort of say do your homework on both before you buy any. Okay, so
100%.
Yeah. Well, Daz, we've done pretty well, mate. We're flying, nearly touching on an hour on this site cost topic. So for those who are a little bit more interested and detail oriented, we hope you've enjoyed. And thank you for listening to this point, and hope you've enjoyed and taken away some really good tips from Darren mainly, and some insights into how site costs really work. Pretty good effort, Daz. Anything else you want to add to it?
I think it is one of those subjects that people do get confused about and concerned over. So if you are one of those people and you're dealing with a builder right now, it doesn't have to be the builders we work for. But if you've got a concern right now and you want a bit of advice, by all means, shoot an email through to us. You can jump on the Home Building Hub website and email us through there, and I'm happy to have a look at it and give you a call and have a bit of a chat, and that might help you as well. So, if that's going to be of some assistance, certainly reach out to us. We're here to help. That's part of why we're doing the podcast, is to really assist you, the listener, feel comfortable about proceeding and building your new home, in an industry that we absolutely love. So. That's great. Yeah. Good on you, mate. Really appreciate the effort as always, Cole.
Awesome. Well, everyone, if you like what you hear, please go on, give us a 5-star review. If you've got any questions, jump on the website, homebuildinghub.com.au. Send it. There's a little question thing, email thing you can use there. And other than that, we thank you for your time, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Good on you, mate. Cheers. Thanks, guys.
1